The announcement came via email, a simple subject line: "Congratulations, you've been selected." I stared at the screen, heart thudding. This was it. My break, the chance to prove myself and create to elevate, the art competition that launched careers. The rules were simple: a new piece every week, elimination at each round, and the grand prize, a gallery deal and $500,000 dangling at the end. I moved into the provided studio apartment the next day. Sparse and industrial, the space had an unnerving sterility. But I was too thrilled to care. I was competing against 20 others, and for the first time in years, I felt like I belonged somewhere. The first week flew by in a haze of paint and adrenaline. My piece, a vivid, chaotic swirl of color, garnered praise from the judges. But their comments struck a nerve. Interesting use of vibrant blues. "I see echoes of your struggles with anxiety here," said one judge, his tone deliberate. I hadn't mentioned my anxiety to anyone. The judge's insights were uncanny, almost invasive, but I brushed it off as perceptiveness. By week 3, the cracks started to show. One contestant, Ava, left the competition after a heated critique. She didn't even return to her apartment. I assumed she'd gone home, but when I reached out to her on social media, her profiles were gone, completely wiped. I mentioned this to Julian, another contestant. "That's weird," he muttered, eyes darting nervously. Ava was in the apartment above me. It sounded like she was packing all night. Maybe she left in a rush? I suggested. "Maybe," Julian replied, but he didn't sound convinced. The 4th week, I found the camera. It was nestled behind a vent in the corner of my studio, its tiny red light blinking. My stomach dropped as I realized it wasn't the only one. Cameras were mounted discreetly along the edges of the room, their lenses angled to capture every brushstroke, every private moment. My heart pounded as I checked the bathroom. Another camera, this one tucked into the light fixture. I felt exposed, violated. Were the judges watching us here too? That night I didn't sleep. I kept hearing whispers, faint and unintelligible, as if the walls themselves were talking. Week 5 brought more eliminations. Each time someone left, their workspace was cleared with military precision. No sign they'd ever been there. When Julian was cut, I visited his studio to say goodbye, but it was locked, his nameplate removed. I confronted one of the production assistants, a woman in a pristine blazer who always smiled too much. "What happens to the eliminated contestants?" I asked. "They leave," she said simply, the words practiced. "Where?" She hesitated. "That's confidential." Week 6 was my breaking point. The judges' critiques grew sharper, laced with intimate details about my life. "Your choice of muted tones suggests self-doubt, likely stemming from your strained relationship with your father," one said. I'd never spoken about my father to anyone here. My hands trembled as I stared at my painting. They weren't just watching, they were mining my life for content. That night, I hacked into the studio's network, desperate for answers. What I found chilled me. The competition wasn't just for art. It was a massive social experiment. Our studios were live-streamed to a hidden subscriber base, viewers paying obscene amounts to watch us unravel under pressure. In the files, I found contracts none of us had seen, detailing full access to our personal lives. The eliminated contestants? They weren't going home. They were being removed from the program for breaches of confidentiality. The final week arrived. I was one of the last two contestants. My final piece, a stark black and white depiction of surveillance, was both my protest and my farewell. I knew I couldn't win. The system was rigged, and I was a threat. The morning of the finale, I left my studio and walked into the judges' meeting. Their eyes widened as I held up the incriminating files. "This ends now," I said, my voice steady. One judge leaned forward, unruffled. "You don't understand," he said. "You're not competing anymore. You're the show." Before I could respond, security flooded the room. They didn't drag me out. They simply ushered me back to my studio and locked the door. The cameras blinked, more active than ever, as if the world was holding its breath. Now I sit here waiting. The finale airs tonight, and the only question left is what role I'll play in their script. "We need a professional," the man said, his tone calm but firm. "A safe that won't open. Name your price." I hesitated. Calls like this often came with complications. But the address, an upscale estate in a gated neighborhood, suggested good money. "I'll take it," I replied, scribbling down the details. The mansion was imposing, with tall iron gates and hedges trimmed to precision. A butler greeted me at the door, leading me to a study where the client waited. Mr. Dwyer, a broad man in an immaculate suit, sat behind a massive oak desk. He motioned toward a wall safe hidden behind a painting. "I need this open tonight," he said, his voice even, his expression unreadable. I got to work, pulling out my tools. It wasn't a particularly complex lock, an older model with a few quirks. Within 20 minutes, the door clicked open, revealing neatly stacked documents and a small case. Dwyer's lips twitched into what could have been a smile. He handed me a thick envelope stuffed with cash. "Forget what you saw. That's your real payment." The warning lingered as I packed up my tools. 2 days later, I saw his house on the news. A raid, federal agents swarming the property, seizing files, dragging out employees. The report mentioned suspected ties to organized crime. My stomach dropped when I recognized the safe. The phone call came hours later. It wasn't Dwyer. It was an investigator. Polite but probing, he asked about my visit to the mansion. I stuck to the basics, claiming I had no idea what was inside the safe. The call ended, but the tension didn't. The next day, things escalated. A black SUV followed me from my workshop to the grocery store and then to my apartment. When I confronted the driver, they simply rolled up the tinted window and drove off. That night, I woke to the sound of glass shattering. My workshop had been ransacked, tools scattered, files gone. A single phrase was spray painted on the wall: "Stay quiet." The authorities weren't the only ones watching. Dwyer's people wanted something too. As I pieced together what little I knew, one detail gnawed at me: the second safe. While working on the first, I noticed a larger vault in the basement, almost hidden behind wine racks. Dwyer hadn't mentioned it, but I'd seen it. Desperation outweighed fear. If I could get back to that house and find out what was in the second safe, maybe I'd have leverage. I returned under cover of darkness, the mansion still under investigation. Slipping past the caution tape, I made my way to the basement. The safe stood silent and ominous. It took longer this time, an hour of careful maneuvering before the lock gave way. Inside, instead of cash or jewelry, I found files marked with the names of politicians, corporate executives, and law enforcement officials. Photographs, documents, even recordings detailing bribes, illegal deals, and worse. I barely had time to process it when the sound of footsteps echoed above me. I stuffed as much as I could into my bag and darted for the back exit. The next week was a blur of paranoia. Every shadow, every passing car felt like a threat. I couldn't go to the police. Half the names in the files were likely connected to them. And Dwyer's associates? They wouldn't stop until they got the files back. I contacted a journalist anonymously, dropping the documents in a secure location. I thought it was over, but the news broke only part of the story, enough to hint at a massive conspiracy, but not enough to bring it down. Now both sides are after me. I sit in a cheap motel room, a burner phone on the table, waiting for the call that will decide my next move. I have just enough of the files left to tip the scales, but every decision comes with a cost. And in the silence of this room, I wonder how long I can keep running. The warehouse was cold and dimly lit when I arrived. A supervisor, wearing a badge that didn't match his calm demeanor, handed me the package, a sealed black case with no labels or markings. "Deliver this to touring facility, Dock 7, he said. "No stops. No questions." I nodded, noting the emphasis. It wasn't unusual for courier work to have some confidentiality, but the security around this job felt heavier than usual. The paycheck, however, was enough to silence my doubts. The facility was over an hour away, deep in a rural area with empty highways stretching between barren fields. As I drove, the case sat on the passenger seat, seemingly ordinary, yet radiating an inexplicable weight. Curiosity simmered, but I pushed it aside. The job was simple: deliver and leave. About halfway there, I felt it, an itch in the back of my mind that refused to be ignored. I pulled into a diner parking lot, away from the main road. The night was quiet, the parking lot deserted except for a single flickering street lamp. My hands trembled as I unlatched the case. Inside were vials of murky liquid, each marked with biohazard symbols and numbers that meant nothing to me. A single sheet of paper was tucked beneath them, but before I could read it, headlights appeared in my rearview mirror. The car parked several spaces away. Two men in dark jackets got out, their movements deliberate but unhurried. My pulse quickened. Closing the case, I slid it under the seat and stepped out of the van, trying to look casual. "Hey," one of them called out, his voice steady but firm. "Got a package for us?" My instinct screamed at me to run, but I held my ground. "I'm on a delivery. It's not for you." The second man reached into his pocket, and I saw the glint of metal, a gun. "We don't have time for games," he said. "Hand it over." I jumped back into the van, slammed the door, and hit the gas. My tires screeched as I sped out of the lot, the other car roaring to life behind me. They stayed on my tail as I swerved onto the highway, my heart pounding with every sharp turn. The van's GPS beeped, rerouting me to the nearest exit. That's when it hit me. The package was being tracked. These men didn't just know where I was. They could follow me anywhere. I veered off the main road, heading into a dense forest. The dirt path was narrow and uneven, jostling the van as I sped through. My pursuers followed, their headlights cutting through the trees like searchlights. I gripped the wheel tightly, barely managing to stay on the path. When the road ended at a clearing, I slammed on the brakes and jumped out, grabbing the case. My breaths were shallow, my mind racing. I couldn't take it back to the facility. They were part of this, but keeping it was just as dangerous. The men were closing in. I could hear their car's engine idling nearby. My eyes darted around, searching for cover. A small, abandoned shed stood at the edge of the clearing. I sprinted toward it, ducking inside just as their flashlight beams swept the area. Inside, the shed was cramped and musty, the air thick with the scent of rotting wood. I crouched behind a stack of rusted tools, clutching the case to my chest. The men's voices carried through the night. "Find him," one said. "We need that package." Minutes felt like hours as they searched the area. When their voices faded, I slipped out the back of the shed and bolted deeper into the forest, following the faint glow of the highway in the distance. By the time I reached the main road, I was exhausted but alive. I flagged down a passing truck, hitching a ride to the nearest town. My delivery van was gone, and so was the case. I'd left it behind in the shed, hoping the trail would go cold. The next day, the news reported a fire in the forest. Authorities claimed it was a controlled burn, but I knew better. Whatever was in that package wasn't meant to be found. I'm back home now, trying to forget, but something feels off. Every car that lingers too long, every stranger's glance, it all feels like a warning. The job is over, but I can't shake the feeling I was part of something far bigger and far more dangerous than I'll ever understand. The ad for the apartment caught my attention immediately. Quiet, historic building. Creative, workspace friendly. Utilities included. It sounded perfect for a writer on a budget, and the rent was unbelievably low for the city. When I toured the place, the landlord, a wiry man with thin hair and an apologetic smile, mentioned that the unit above mine was vacant. "No worries about noise," he assured me. I signed the lease that same day. The first night was uneventful, just the occasional groan of the old pipes and the hum of the radiator. By the second night, the noises began, faint at first. A dragging sound like someone moving furniture across the floor directly above me. It was odd since the apartment was supposed to be empty. By the third night, it was louder. Thud, scrape, drag. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my frustration growing with every noise. The next morning, I went upstairs and knocked on the door. No answer. The hallway smelled faintly of dust and old wood, and the door looked untouched, its keyhole gleaming with disuse. I tried the handle, but it was locked. The landlord dismissed my concerns when I brought it up. "This is an old building," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "Sometimes it settles." Settles? That was an understatement. The noises got worse, louder, and more erratic. Sometimes it was furniture, sometimes it sounded like someone pacing. Once, I heard a crash so loud it shook the light fixture in my kitchen. That night, I couldn't take it anymore. Armed with a flashlight, I crept back upstairs. The door was slightly ajar this time, as if it had been left open for me. My stomach twisted, but curiosity pushed me forward. The apartment was immaculate. The furniture was antique, arranged precisely. A dining table was set for two, complete with plates and silverware. The air was still, the silence oppressive. It felt like stepping into a museum exhibit, everything frozen in a snapshot of a life long gone. Then I noticed the dust, or rather the lack of it. Not a speck on the surfaces, The room smelled faintly of lemon polish, as though someone had cleaned it that very day. I turned toward the bedroom, the sound of my footsteps muffled by a plush rug. The bed was made perfectly, the pillows fluffed and symmetrical. On the nightstand sat a photograph of a couple, their smiles faded by time. That's when I heard it, a faint whisper, low and indistinct, coming from the walls. My chest tightened as I turned back toward the door, only to find it closed. My hand shot to the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The whispering grew louder, overlapping voices forming a dissonant hum. Panic surged through me. I banged on the door, shouting for help, but the building swallowed my cries. The whispers became clearer, fragments of sentences in a language I didn't understand. The lights flickered into brief moments of darkness. I swore I saw shadows moving, not cast by me but by something else, something unseen. Desperate, I searched the room for another way out. The window was sealed shut, the glass warped with age. My phone had no signal. I opened drawers and cabinets, finding them empty save for faint scratches on the inside, as if someone had clawed at them in desperation. Suddenly, the voices stopped. The silence was suffocating. I turned back to the bedroom and froze. The photo on the nightstand, it had changed. The smiling couple was gone, replaced by a single figure staring directly at the camera. It was me. The door creaked open behind me, but no one was there. I didn't question my chance to escape. I bolted down the stairs and into my apartment, locking the door behind me. My hands were shaking as I leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath. The next morning, I packed my things and left. The landlord didn't ask why, and I didn't offer an explanation. Weeks later, I Googled the building out of morbid curiosity. Buried in decades-old news clippings, I found a story about a couple who had lived there in the 1960s. They were found dead in their apartment, their belongings untouched, the cause of death never determined. I never told anyone what I saw, but sometimes in the dead of night, I still hear that dragging sound. And I wonder if it's coming from the place I left or from somewhere much closer. The terminal was quiet as I boarded my final flight. 20 years as a flight attendant, and this was my last shift before retirement. It was a red-eye from New York to Chicago, a route I'd done countless times. As passengers trickled on board, I did my usual routine. Warm smiles, checking seat belts, offering reassurance to the nervous flyers. Everything felt normal until he boarded. He was mid-40s, dressed in a plain hoodie and jeans. His face was unremarkable, but his movements were deliberate, too calculated. He didn't meet anyone's eyes as he walked to his seat in the middle of the plane. Something about him made my stomach tighten, though I couldn't pinpoint why. We were 30 minutes into the flight when he stood up abruptly. I was near the galley, preparing a round of drinks, when he brushed past me toward the cockpit. I stepped into the aisle to block his path. "Sir, please return to your seat," I said, my voice calm but firm. He didn't stop. Instead, he turned to me, lowering his voice so only I could hear. "There's a bomb on board. I need to speak with the pilots." My breath caught, but I held my composure. "Sir, let's not alarm anyone." "I'm not here to hurt anyone," he interrupted, his tone eerily steady. "But if you don't let me through, we all go down." My heart raced as I followed him to the cockpit. The pilots, alerted by my knock, opened the door cautiously. The man didn't waste time. "You've got sensitive documents on board. Seat 16B. If I don't get them, this plane doesn't land safely." The captain's face hardened. "We're trained for these situations," he said, his voice controlled. "What do you want?" "The documents," the man repeated, glancing at me as if I were supposed to understand. "You know what I'm talking about." I didn't, but the captain hesitated just long enough for doubt to creep in. Was this man bluffing? Did he have help? The cockpit felt suffocating, the tension thick as turbulence. After a tense standoff, the man backed out of the cockpit, his hands raised. "Fine," he said. "But remember, I warned you." I followed him as he returned to his seat. As he sat down, I noticed the passenger in 16B, a middle-aged woman clutching a leather briefcase. Her expression was calm, but her knuckles were white as she gripped the handle. I realized she hadn't said a word the entire flight. When I offered her a drink, she declined without looking at me. Something about her silence was just as unsettling as the man's threats. I returned to the galley, pretending to busy myself while keeping an eye on both of them. It didn't take long before he stood again, this time heading straight for 16B. The woman flinched as he leaned over her, whispering something I couldn't hear. She shook her head, holding the briefcase tighter. Then he yelled, "She has it. That's what I'm here for." Heads turned, murmurs rippling through the cabin. I stepped forward, trying to de-escalate. "Sir, sit down." "She's working with them," he shouted, pointing at the woman. "She's got classified files. This is bigger than you think." The woman looked up at me, her voice trembling. "He's lying." The plane buzzed with tension. Passengers shifted nervously, craning their necks to watch. I signaled another attendant to notify the captain. We needed backup when we landed, but as I leaned down to speak to the woman, she whispered, "He's right." The words hit like a slap. She opened the briefcase just enough for me to glimpse its contents. Folders stamped with a government seal, labeled in bold red, "Top secret." "Don't let him take this," she said, her voice low but urgent. "You don't know what he'll do." By now, the man was pacing the aisle, his eyes darting between the woman and the cockpit door. He wasn't armed, at least not visibly, but his desperation was palpable. The passengers were on edge, whispering, some clutching their phones. The plane began its descent. I knew we'd be met by security, but we still had minutes to go. Minutes that felt like hours. I stepped into the aisle, blocking his path once again. "Sir, sit down." "Now." "I'm trying to save lives," he hissed. "You don't get it? What's in that case? It'll destroy everything." Behind me, the woman clutched her briefcase tighter, her gaze steady. I didn't know who to trust, but I made my decision. When we landed, the man was escorted off the plane first, handcuffed and shouting about conspiracies. The woman left quietly, surrounded by men in dark suits who blended seamlessly into the airport crowd. As I stepped off the plane, the captain pulled me aside. "Good work tonight," he said. "But whatever you saw, forget it. I tried. But even now, I wonder who was telling the truth." The man's words haunt me, as does the briefcase's forbidden contents. And sometimes I think I made the wrong choice. It started as an ordinary day at the office, sifting through account audits and ledgers. As a financial analyst for one of the top investment firms in the city, my job was to ensure that everything balanced and every transaction followed the law. But one set of accounts didn't make sense. It wasn't just the numbers, they were perfect, almost too perfect. Massive sums moved through shell companies and offshore accounts, always landing in untraceable pockets. What caught my attention was the timing. Every major deposit coincided with a disaster. A factory fire, a collapsed bridge, a cyber attack. I flagged the accounts for review and emailed my supervisor. "Looks suspicious," I wrote, attaching the files. A few hours later, I was called into his office. "Drop it," he said without looking up from his desk. I frowned. "Sir, this could be a major issue. Fraud. Maybe even—" "Leave it alone," he interrupted, his tone sharp. "These accounts are above your clearance." Clearance? That wasn't how things worked here. My unease grew, but I nodded and left. Back at my desk, I stared at the files, their red flags glaring on my screen. I copied them onto a flash drive before closing everything down. That evening, I dove deeper. Alone in my apartment, surrounded by the glow of my laptop, I traced the transactions back years. Each one was tied to a catastrophe that had made headlines. Fires, floods, accidents, all seemingly random until I saw the pattern. Each disaster created chaos in the stock market, and each time, our firm came out ahead, making massive gains. It wasn't coincidence. Someone was orchestrating the disasters, profiting off the panic they caused. The knock at my door startled me. My stomach clenched as I glanced at the clock. It was nearly midnight. I wasn't expecting anyone. I approached cautiously, peeking through the peephole. No one was there. When I opened the door, I found an envelope on the floor. Inside was a single typed note. "Walk away while you still can." My chest tightened as I scanned the hallway. It was empty, silent except for the hum of the elevator at the far end. I locked the door and bolted it for good measure. The next morning, I arrived at work to find my access restricted. My computer login didn't work, and the files I'd flagged were gone. My supervisor called me into a meeting room. "We're placing you on administrative leave," he said, his expression unreadable. "Why?" I demanded. "Because I did my job." He sighed, almost as if he pitied me. "Some things are bigger than you. Take the leave, go home, and think carefully about your next steps." I left the office with a box of my things and the growing realization that I was being silenced. That night, I noticed the flash drive was missing. I tore apart my apartment, searching every drawer, every pocket of my bag, but it was gone. My paranoia deepened when I spotted a car parked across the street. It hadn't been there before, and it didn't leave for hours. I couldn't sleep. The pieces were falling into place, too perfectly, just like those accounts. Whoever was behind this had power, resources, and no hesitation about using them. The next morning, I received an email from an encrypted address. Attached were documents I'd never seen before, blueprints, communications, and schedules for disasters that hadn't happened yet. Fires, floods, even a train derailment. The scale of it was staggering. The email ended with a question. "Are you with us or against us?" I didn't respond. Instead, I contacted a journalist I trusted. We arranged to meet in a quiet cafe far from the city center. I brought everything I had, the email, screenshots, and printed records of the transactions. As I waited, sipping coffee and watching the door, I noticed a man sitting 2 tables away. He wasn't drinking or eating, just reading a newspaper that he hadn't turned a page of in 20 minutes. When the journalist arrived, The man stood and left. I handed over the documents, explaining everything in hushed tones. She promised to investigate. The next day, the journalist's phone was disconnected. Her website went dark. When I called her office, her colleagues claimed she had taken an extended leave. Then, I received another note. "We warned you." I don't know what to do. The files are gone. The people I trusted unreachable. My bank accounts have been frozen. My phone tapped. I'm sure of it. I'm trapped in a web that feels impossible to escape. And every time I hear about a disaster on the news, I wonder how much longer I have before I'm the next casualty. The lab was deeper underground than I expected, behind 3 checkpoints and a steel door that hissed when it sealed. I'd been hired for my expertise in ancient scripts, an opportunity too prestigious and lucrative to refuse. The text they handed me, locked in a temperature-controlled case, looked like something out of a museum exhibit. Yellowed parchment, ink faded but legible. "It's ancient," Dr. Lehman, the project lead, said, his tone clipped. "Decipher it, but no notes leave the lab. All your work stays on these terminals." Understood? I nodded. The stakes were clear, but so were the red flags. The first few symbols were straightforward, variations of a lost script I'd studied during my post-grad years. At first, the fragments seemed to tell a history of a forgotten civilization, stories of their leaders, conflicts, and achievements. But then the details grew strange. A reference to great towers falling in clouds of ash. Another describing waves of sickness spreading across distant lands. The dates were impossible. The script, thousands of years old, described events far too recent. I approached Dr. Lehman with my findings. "This isn't ancient," I said. "These details are modern. Did someone alter the text?" He gave me a thin smile. "Just keep working." The dismissal irritated me, but curiosity outweighed my frustration. I returned to the terminal, diving deeper into the translations. Over the next week, the text became eerily precise. Specific names and places appeared, tied to historical catastrophes and events. Wars, pandemics, economic collapses. The lab became suffocating. The constant hum of servers filled the air, and cameras tracked every move. The guards, armed and silent, loomed near the doors like statues. No one spoke to each other unless absolutely necessary. One night, I stayed late, too engrossed in a particularly perplexing passage to notice the time. The lab was quiet, save for the tapping of keys. That's when I saw it. On the screen, a section of text I hadn't yet translated. The symbols rearranged themselves in real time, forming new phrases. I froze, staring at the screen. Scripts don't rewrite themselves. My pulse quickened as I wrote down the new symbols. They formed a message. Do not trust them. The next day, Lehman was waiting for me. He didn't mention the altered text, but handed me new pages to decode. His expression was calm, almost too calm. "We're close to a breakthrough," he said, though I couldn't imagine what that meant. I worked through the pages, my unease growing. The messages now seemed less like history and more like predictions. I translated one section that spoke of a conflict born in the East, dividing the world in shadow. Another hinted at voices silenced in the age of their greatest power. The implications were horrifying. That evening, I tried accessing previous translations, but the system denied me. Files I'd worked on for weeks were suddenly restricted. When I asked Lehman, his smile didn't reach his eyes. "Focus on the new text," he said. I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. Cameras weren't just in the corners of the lab. They were embedded in the walls, the ceiling, even the monitors. Every keystroke, every glance was recorded. On the 6th day, I decided to test the system. I scribbled a note. "Why am I here?" and tucked it under my keyboard. The next morning, it was gone. By then, sleep had become impossible. The weight of the text, combined with the oppressive atmosphere of the lab, was crushing. My thoughts raced as I pieced together the fragments. The scripts weren't documenting the past. They were mapping the future. When I finally confronted Lehman, his calm demeanor shattered for the first time. "You weren't supposed to figure it out," he said, his voice low. "The algorithm only needs the symbols. The rest is predictions." I interrupted. "You're using ancient patterns to predict the future." He didn't deny it. Instead, he motioned toward the door, where 2 guards stood waiting. "You've seen too much. Your work here is finished." They escorted me out, not to the exit, but to a dimly lit room with a single chair and a camera mounted on the wall. "Sit," one of them ordered. I didn't comply. Instead, I lunged for the door, only to feel a sharp sting in my neck. My vision blurred as I crumpled to the floor. The last thing I saw was Lehman's face, impassive, as he stepped into the room. I woke up in my apartment, the lab of foggy memory. My notes, my phone, even my access card were gone. On my desk sat a typed letter. "Your contract is terminated. Any breach of confidentiality will result in consequences." But the worst part was the news that night. A headline scrolling across the screen. "Unprecedented storm devastates coastal cities." Experts claim it was unpredictable. The symbols from the lab flashed in my mind, and I knew it had all been written long before it ever happened. When the rejection email landed in my inbox, I felt like my chest had been crushed. I'd been so sure I nailed the interview. The dream position at Titan Financial, a place that could change everything. As I stared at the words, "Thank you, but we've chosen another candidate," my phone buzzed with an unknown number. "Hello. I heard you didn't get the job," a calm, assured voice said. "But I can help you." The man introduced himself as Patrick, a career consultant. He'd seen my resume online and claimed he could give me a second chance. "You're qualified," he said, "but companies look for more than skills. They want confidence, prestige, the right story. I can give you that." I hesitated. It sounded shady, but the desperation in me outweighed my skepticism. I agreed to meet him. Patrick's office was nondescript. A plain desk, a laptop, and a few filing cabinets. He laid out a plan, a fabricated work history, glowing references, and an elite alma mater added to my CV. "It's not lying," he said. "It's leveling the playing field." Days later, I received a new resume, polished and embellished. It was everything I wasn't: degrees from Ivy League schools, positions at prestigious firms, recommendations from former managers. It felt like holding a ticket to a new life. Titan Financial called me back within 48 hours. The job was everything I'd imagined. Corner offices, high-stakes projects, colleagues who treated me like I belonged. I buried the guilt of my fake credentials under the mountain of work, telling myself it didn't matter if I could deliver. And I did deliver, outperforming my peers within weeks. But then things started to unravel. It began with the routine background check. HR sent an email requesting additional verification for my records. Panic bubbled under the surface as I forwarded it to Patrick. "Don't worry," he assured me. "I'll handle it." The next day, HR emailed again, this time more pointed. "We need you to provide direct contact information for your previous supervisors." I called Patrick in a frenzy. He laughed it off. "They won't dig that deep. Just send them the numbers I gave you." That evening, I found a flash drive on my desk. No note, no explanation. Inside were files, emails, invoices, and spreadsheets, all tying Titan to offshore accounts and money laundering schemes. My stomach churned as I realized what I'd stumbled into. The next day, a man I didn't recognize pulled me aside in the break room. He introduced himself as a senior executive and whispered, "We need to talk." He led me to an empty conference room and closed the blinds. "We know about the flash drive," he said, his tone low and controlled. "You're smart enough to stay out of it, right?" I nodded, my throat dry. But as soon as I got home, Patrick called. "They're testing you," he said. "They want to see if you're loyal. Stay quiet, and you'll be fine." I didn't feel fine. I felt trapped. The flash drive was gone when I returned to my desk the next morning. In its place was a single sheet of paper, a contract for a special project that required complete confidentiality. When I hesitated to sign, the executive appeared again. "We gave you this chance," he said, his smile a threat. "It'd be a shame to see it wasted." The next week was a blur of late-night meetings and encrypted documents. I wasn't just laundering money. I was facilitating it. Every keystroke felt like another nail in my coffin. When I tried to contact Patrick, he was uncharacteristically curt. "You knew what you were getting into," he said. "No, I didn't," I snapped. "This isn't what I wanted." His voice dropped. "Then maybe you shouldn't have lied your way in." One night, I returned home to find my apartment ransacked. Nothing was taken, but my laptop was missing, along with the fake resume Patrick had created. On my kitchen counter, a note read, "You're in too deep. Don't make us clean up your mess." Now I'm stuck. I can't go to the authorities. The forged credentials tie me to Patrick, and the evidence makes me an accomplice. If I stay, I'll keep digging a deeper hole. If I run, I'll have nowhere to hide. Every email I send, every phone call I make feels like it's being monitored. My dream job has become a nightmare, and the walls are closing in. I wanted success so badly, and now it's cost me everything, including my freedom. Don't forget to subscribe. You are the best.